In a quiet suburban neighborhood, nestled between carefully trimmed lawns and identical rows of pastel-painted houses, there existed an unwritten rule that everyone seemed to obey. Perfection was mandatory. Every yard had to be manicured, every trash bin hidden away, and every car parked at just the right angle. But beneath the illusion of order and harmony, tension often simmered just below the surface. It was a place where gossip spread faster than wildfire, and where one particular woman thrived on enforcing rules that weren't even official. Her name was Margaret, though nearly everyone in the neighborhood called her Karen behind closed doors. She was the self-appointed watchdog of the Homeowners Association, a woman who believed her mission in life was to police every single detail of her neighbors' lives. If a child left a bicycle on the sidewalk, Karen would snap a photo. If a lawn looked even slightly overgrown, she would slip an anonymous note into the homeowner's mailbox. She had made enemies before, but no one dared confront her directly. That was until she crossed paths with her new neighbor, a man named Daniel, who had recently moved into the neighborhood with his rather unusual companion. Unlike the other residents, Daniel had no interest in blending in. He wasn't the type to obsess over lawn ornaments or the shade of beige allowed for shutters. He worked long hours remotely, kept mostly to himself, and enjoyed the quiet life. But the most noticeable difference between Daniel and his neighbors was that he owned a bear. Yes, an actual bear. It wasn't a wild animal Daniel had stumbled across, but a trained rescue bear named Brutus. Daniel had worked with wildlife rehabilitation for years, and when Brutus had been deemed non-releasable due to his dependency on humans, Daniel took him in. Brutus was massive, standing taller than most men when on his hind legs, yet he was gentle, calm, and surprisingly well-behaved. He spent most of his time in the spacious, reinforced backyard enclosure Daniel had built, lounging in the shade or splashing in his pond. At first, neighbors whispered and gawked, snapping photos from across the street. Some were fascinated, some were terrified, and some thought it was a liability waiting to happen. But Karen saw Brutus as an affront to everything she believed the neighborhood stood for. In her eyes, a bear was not only dangerous, but also unsightly. It ruined the image she worked so hard to uphold. For weeks, she kept her distance, filing complaints to the HOA board, demanding that Daniel be forced to remove Brutus. But Daniel had anticipated this. He had every permit, every license, every document neatly in order. Legally, there was nothing anyone could do. Brutus wasn't a threat, and Daniel wasn't breaking any rules. Karen's fury grew with every rejection letter she received from the board, each one reminding her that Daniel was within his rights. Then came the day of the honk. It was a crisp Saturday morning, the kind when families strolled down the sidewalks with coffee in hand and dogs on leashes. Daniel was outside, raking leaves near the front of his yard, while Brutus dozed peacefully in his enclosure. The bear's massive body was curled against the fence line, his breathing steady, his eyes half closed in the sun. Karen drove by in her silver SUV, her windows rolled down, her expression tight with disdain. She slowed when she saw Brutus lounging by the fence. To her, it was offensive, a beast, she thought, sprawled out for the whole world to see. She gripped her steering wheel tighter, her irritation bubbling into action. Then she laid on her horn. The sharp blast shattered the peaceful morning, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Birds scattered from trees, dogs barked, and Brutus, startled, jerked awake with a deep guttural growl. His massive head whipped toward the street, his nostrils flaring as he rose to his full, intimidating height. The neighbors nearby froze in place, their eyes wide, unsure of what was about to happen. Daniel dropped his rake, his jaw tightening as he saw what had happened. Brutus, though startled, didn't attack or lash out. He simply stood there, glaring in the direction of the SUV, his deep chest rumbling with low, unsettled sounds. Karen, satisfied with her stunt, drove off smugly, her chin raised high as if she had proven some kind of point. She thought she had rattled Daniel, proven that she had the upper hand. But what she didn't realize was that she had just crossed a line she would regret. Word of the incident spread quickly. Neighbors whispered about Karen honking at the bear, about how reckless and petty it was. Some began questioning if Karen herself had gone too far this time. Daniel, however, said nothing. He simply calmed Brutus, soothing the bear back into comfort, and went about his day. But deep down he was already formulating a plan. Karen's attempt to intimidate had backfired. Instead of making Brutus look dangerous, she had made herself look unhinged. Yet she didn't see it that way. She doubled down in her crusade, walking the sidewalks with a clipboard, snapping photos of Brutus through the fence, sending more and more complaints to the HOA board. Her obsession grew, and with every new escalation, she believed she was closer to forcing Daniel out. But Daniel was patient. He knew that Karen's arrogance would be her undoing. And while Brutus was a gentle giant, Daniel also knew the bear had a presence that could unsettle even the boldest of people. The honk had awoken more than just Brutus. It had awoken Daniel's resolve. Karen wanted a battle, and though he had no intention of breaking the law, he was ready to give her exactly what she was asking for. And soon the neighborhood would see just how far Karen was willing to go, and just how badly it would backfire. As the sun set that evening, Brutus settled back into his enclosure, his amber eyes glowing in the fading light. Daniel stood on his porch, watching Karen's house across the street, a faint smile on his lips. The game had begun, though only one of them understood the rules. What Karen believed would be her victory would soon turn into her humiliation. Because when you honk at a bear, you'd better be ready for the consequences. The stage was set. The neighborhood was watching. And the savage payback was only just beginning. The fallout from the honking incident lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Neighbors couldn't stop talking about it. Some laughed quietly at the absurdity, shaking their heads at Karen's antics. Others expressed concern, saying she had pushed too far by deliberately startling a bear. Parents whispered about moving their children's playdates to streets farther away, just to avoid being anywhere near her when she was in one of her moods. For Karen, however, none of it mattered. In her mind, she had done the neighborhood a service. She had tested the bear, she told a few close allies, proving that it was unpredictable and unsafe. She even started spreading a twisted version of the story, that Brutus had lunged toward the fence, snarling, as if ready to break free. The embellishments grew with every retelling. By the end of the week, Karen was insisting she had narrowly escaped being mauled, all because of Daniel's reckless choice to house a predator in a residential area. Daniel heard these rumors but stayed silent. He knew the truth, and so did the people who had witnessed the incident. What Karen didn't realize was that she was isolating herself. The more she exaggerated, the more neighbors began rolling their eyes. She wasn't rallying support. She was alienating it. Daniel, meanwhile, took a different approach. He leaned into transparency. He began inviting neighbors to see Brutus up close from the safe side of the reinforced enclosure. He explained the bear's history, his rescue story, and how he had been trained. Children giggled as Brutus lumbered over to the fence to accept a treat, while adults marveled at the size of the animal. Far from dangerous, Brutus appeared calm, even dignified, like a living monument of strength and patience. This only made Karen more furious. To her, Daniel was staging a performance, tricking people into believing a wild animal was harmless. She became obsessed with catching even the slightest misstep. Every time Brutus moved, Karen was there with her phone out, recording. If Daniel left a bag of feed near the gate for a moment too long, she documented it. If Brutus growled during feeding, she claimed it was a sign of aggression. Her collection of evidence grew, though none of it held any real weight. And then Karen made her next move. Late one afternoon, just as the sun dipped low and the neighborhood filled with the hum of lawnmowers and the laughter of children riding bikes, Karen marched to the HOA president's house. She carried a thick folder stuffed with printed photos and handwritten notes, all compiled into what she proudly called her case file. Inside, she made her demands clear. Brutus needed to go. She cited community safety, property value decline, and psychological distress. She waved her photos like proof, even though most of them showed nothing more than Brutus lounging or eating. The HOA president, Mr. Thompson, listened patiently but was unimpressed. He reminded her again that Daniel was fully licensed and in compliance with all regulations. Brutus wasn't a violation. Karen's face flushed crimson. She had expected immediate action, maybe even a unanimous vote to evict Daniel. Instead, she got polite dismissal. Storming out of the house, Karen vowed she wouldn't give up. She told herself the HOA was spineless, too afraid to act, but she had courage. And if no one else would deal with Daniel and his bear, she would handle it herself. That night, Daniel sat on his back porch, sipping a cup of tea while Brutus splashed lazily in his pond. The air was calm, but Daniel's instincts told him the peace wouldn't last. He had dealt with difficult neighbors before, but Karen's intensity was different. She wasn't just being nosy, she was waging a personal war. And wars always escalated. Daniel decided it was time to prepare. He checked every lock, every camera, every barrier around Brutus's enclosure. He reinforced the gates, upgraded the lighting, and made sure every inch of his property was secure. If Karen wanted to play games, she would find no weaknesses here. Days passed, and the neighborhood adjusted to its new rhythm. Daniel and Brutus becoming something of a local attraction, Karen seething from the sidelines. But beneath the surface, tensions built. Karen's frustration reached a breaking point one Saturday morning. While Daniel hosted a small gathering of neighbors to show Brutus's feeding routine, Karen stood across the street, arms crossed, her eyes narrowed into slits. She honked her horn again, not as long as before, but enough to startle everyone present. Brutus simply flicked an ear, unbothered this time, but the guests flinched and looked around nervously. Daniel didn't react outwardly. He finished the demonstration, thanked his guests, and returned inside. But he noted something important. Karen was no longer just targeting him. She was disrupting the peace of the entire block. The neighbors began to turn on her. Some confronted her directly, asking why she was harassing Daniel. Others avoided her altogether, crossing the street when they saw her coming. The balance of power shifted, and for the first time, Karen found herself on the defensive. And yet she refused to back down. Her next attempt came in the form of a late-night stunt. A motion-activated camera captured it clearly. Karen creeping onto Daniel's property with a flashlight, peering into Brutus's enclosure and snapping photos. Brutus, half asleep, rose from his spot and ambled closer to the fence. The camera caught Karen stumbling backward in panic, nearly tripping over her own feet as she fled into the night. When Daniel reviewed the footage the next morning, he shook his head slowly. Karen had just handed him exactly what he needed. Proof, evidence, a reason to push back. But Daniel didn't take the footage to the HOA, at least not yet. Instead, he waited. He wanted Karen to believe she still had control, to dig herself deeper, because the more she pushed, the worse her downfall would be. The neighborhood grew tense. Rumors swirled about Karen's midnight trespassing, about the honking, about the growing feud. People began to pick sides. Most sided with Daniel, impressed by his patience and his bear's calm demeanor. A few, though, whispered that maybe Karen had a point, that perhaps one day Brutus might snap. It was exactly the sliver of doubt Karen clung to. And then came the day that changed everything. It started innocently enough. Daniel setting up a new feeder inside the enclosure while Brutus lumbered curiously beside him. Neighbors gathered at a distance, watching with interest. But Karen appeared too, camera in hand, determined to capture something she could twist into proof of danger. She parked her SUV right by the curb, honked repeatedly, and shouted through the open window, trying to provoke a reaction. Brutus didn't lunge. He didn't roar. Instead, he slowly turned his massive head toward the noise and began walking closer to the fence. Calm, silent, intent. His amber eyes locked on the vehicle, unblinking. The neighbors held their breath. Karen, suddenly unsure, stopped honking. For the first time, she seemed to realize she had no control over the situation. The bear's presence wasn't just intimidating, it was commanding. Brutus reached the edge of the enclosure and sat down heavily, staring directly at her. The silence was deafening. The neighborhood stood frozen. Karen fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking, and quickly drove off, tires squealing. But what she didn't know was that her performance had been recorded by multiple neighbors from multiple angles. And this time, Daniel wasn't going to let it slide. The moment had come to turn Karen's obsession against her. The recording spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours of Karen's honking spectacle, at least 3 neighbors had uploaded clips to the community group chat. The footage showed everything. Karen idling in her SUV, blaring her horn like a siren, Brutus calmly approaching the fence without a single sign of aggression, and Karen speeding away in a panic. The contrast was striking. The bear serene and composed, the woman unhinged and erratic. By the next morning, Karen's carefully curated image as the neighborhood protector had cracked wide open. Messages poured through the group chat, some mocking her, others outright condemning her behavior. Words like reckless, unstable, and attention-seeking appeared again and again. For the first time, it was Karen, not Daniel, who was at the center of scrutiny. Daniel read every message but didn't comment. He didn't need to. The neighborhood was doing the work for him. He continued his routine as if nothing had happened, walking his yard, feeding Brutus, chatting casually with neighbors. Meanwhile, Karen stewed in silence. Her SUV stayed parked in her driveway, her blinds remained drawn, but her fury was palpable. Everyone knew she wouldn't retreat quietly. Sure enough, 2 days later, Karen resurfaced with a new plan. She filed a formal complaint with the county, claiming Daniel was endangering public safety by housing a dangerous animal. She included her folder of evidence, now swollen with photos, notes, and her own dramatic retellings. She even cited the recent honking incident, framing it as proof of Brutus's volatility, carefully omitting the part where she caused the disturbance. When the county inspector arrived at Daniel's home, the neighborhood gathered to watch. Karen stood across the street, arms folded, a smug grin plastered on her face. She believed this was the moment Daniel would finally be exposed. But Daniel was ready. He greeted the inspector politely, provided every document, licenses, permits, safety inspections, veterinary records. He even gave a tour of the enclosure, pointing out the reinforced barriers, double gates, and monitoring systems. Brutus, ever the calm giant, ambled around his pond and sat under a tree, completely unfazed by the scrutiny. The inspector's visit lasted nearly an hour. Karen shifted impatiently on the curb, waiting for the condemnation she thought inevitable. Instead, the inspector thanked Daniel for his cooperation, confirmed everything was in order, and left without issuing a single violation. The smirk vanished from Karen's face. The neighbors chuckled under their breath as she stomped back to her house, her shoulders rigid with humiliation. But Daniel knew this wouldn't be the end. Karen's obsession had reached a point where logic and reason no longer mattered. She wasn't interested in truth, she wanted victory. And the more she failed, the more dangerous her desperation became. That night, Daniel checked his cameras again. He replayed the footage of Karen's late-night trespassing, her stumbling retreat when Brutus approached the fence. He had kept it quiet until now, but with her escalation, he began considering his options. He could take the footage to the authorities. He could file a restraining order. He could finally turn the tables. But a part of him wanted Karen to reveal her hand completely, to let her spiral until she had no excuses left. The following week, Karen's behavior grew erratic. She patrolled the sidewalks like a guard on duty, glaring at anyone who stopped to admire Brutus. She hissed warnings at children, muttering that they were in danger. She cornered neighbors with long rants about lawsuits and liability. Most brushed her off, but some began recording her outbursts, adding fuel to the growing archive of her antics. Daniel remained patient, almost eerily calm. He knew something Karen didn't. Patience wasn't weakness. It was strategy. And then, one evening, Karen made her boldest move yet. It was just after sunset when Daniel heard the metallic clang of his gate being rattled. He checked his security feed and saw her, Karen, dressed in dark clothes, fumbling with the latch as if trying to force it open. In her hand was a long stick, something she clearly intended to use to provoke Brutus. Brutus, alerted by the noise, lumbered closer, his massive form emerging from the shadows. He stopped a few feet from the fence, his body still, his eyes glowing faintly in the camera's infrared light. Karen jabbed the stick through the bars, poking toward him. Brutus swiped once, not to harm, but to push the stick away, splintering it instantly with his sheer strength. The sound of the crack echoed across the yard. Karen stumbled back, her face pale, and bolted toward the street. Daniel saved the footage. He didn't confront her. Not yet. He knew what this meant. Karen had crossed into dangerous territory, not just honking, not just trespassing, but actively provoking a wild animal. She had made herself a liability to everyone. including the HOA she claimed to represent. The next morning, Daniel casually mentioned to a few neighbors that he had video evidence of Karen trying to agitate Brutus. Their reactions were explosive. Word spread faster than ever before. By noon, half the street was buzzing about Karen's stunt. By evening, her reputation was in shambles. Still, Karen didn't stop. She doubled down, insisting Daniel had doctored the footage, that the neighbors were conspiring against her. She ranted online, posting long tirades about being persecuted for telling the truth. But the more she fought, the more unhinged she looked. Even her closest allies began to distance themselves, unwilling to be dragged into her crusade. For Daniel, the pieces were falling into place. He had the evidence, the support of the neighborhood, and the patience to see it through. But he wasn't the type to simply humiliate Karen. He wanted to make sure that when the payback came, it would be undeniable, irreversible, and entirely of her own making. The opportunity arrived sooner than he expected. One afternoon, the HOA scheduled a community meeting to address growing tensions. Attendance was unusually high. People wanted answers, and more importantly, they wanted resolution. Karen arrived early, clutching her swollen folder of complaints, convinced this was her stage to finally rally support. Daniel arrived late, calm as ever, with nothing in his hands but a flash drive. The meeting began with Karen launching into a tirade, waving her photos and notes, declaring Brutus a menace and Daniel a reckless neighbor. She honked her horn for emphasis in a theatrical reenactment, her voice shrill, her gestures wild. The room shifted uncomfortably. Whispers spread. Eyes rolled. Karen didn't notice. She was too caught up in her own performance. Then it was Daniel's turn. He spoke softly, methodically, presenting facts instead of emotions. He pulled up the video clips. Karen honking, Karen trespassing at night, Karen jabbing a stick through the enclosure. Each one played on the projector for everyone to see. Gasps filled the room. The contrast was undeniable. Daniel calm, Brutus calm, Karen out of control. By the time the last clip ended, the room was silent. Karen's face burned red, her mouth opening and closing with no words coming out. For once, she had nothing to say. The HOA president cleared his throat, and though his words were measured, the verdict was clear. Karen was the problem, not Daniel. But this wasn't the end. Daniel knew Karen wouldn't accept defeat gracefully. She would lash out one final time, desperate to salvage her pride. And when she did, it would mark the moment of her complete downfall. The fallout from the HOA meeting rippled through the neighborhood like a shockwave. By the next morning, the story was all anyone could talk about. Karen's humiliation was complete. She had been exposed on the projector for everyone to see, her antics laid bare, her credibility shattered. No amount of excuses could erase the images of her trespassing, honking, or jabbing at Brutus's enclosure. For most people, this would have been the end. A moment to retreat, lick wounds, and perhaps quietly fade into the background. But Karen wasn't most people. Her pride was too fragile. Her need for control too consuming. In her mind, she hadn't lost the battle. She had been sabotaged. Daniel, she told herself, had manipulated the narrative, turned the neighbors against her, and humiliated her on purpose. Her obsession shifted from Brutus to revenge. In the days that followed, Karen's behavior became erratic. She stopped speaking to almost everyone. Her blinds stayed shut. Her car rarely left the driveway, and yet neighbors reported seeing her pacing near her windows, muttering to herself, scribbling notes furiously into a journal. Some whispered that she was unraveling, others that she was plotting something reckless. Daniel, however, remained steady. He went about his life with quiet composure, tending to Brutus, chatting with neighbors, hosting small gatherings. His calmness only fueled Karen's resentment. She wanted him to squirm, to react, to acknowledge her power. But Daniel gave her nothing. And nothing was more infuriating to someone like Karen than being ignored. It was only a matter of time before she made her final move. One humid evening, just as twilight settled over the neighborhood, Daniel's security cameras picked up movement again. Karen, dressed in dark clothes, had returned to his property. This time, she wasn't just peering through the fence. She carried a large bag and what looked like raw meat. Her plan was reckless, dangerous, and desperate. She intended to toss the meat into Brutus's enclosure, hoping to incite some frenzy, something she could record and use as proof of his instability. Perhaps she imagined the bear roaring, tearing at the food, looking vicious enough to validate her months of claims. But Karen had underestimated both Daniel and Brutus. The cameras caught everything. Her fumbling with the bag, her awkward attempt to heave the meat over the fence, her startled gasp when Brutus didn't respond with violence, but with calm curiosity. Instead of lunging or roaring, Brutus sniffed at the meat, pawed it once, then simply walked away, uninterested. The carefully staged drama fell flat. What Karen didn't realize was that Daniel had already fortified the enclosure to prevent exactly this kind of interference. The meat never even landed inside. It rolled harmlessly back toward her feet. In frustration, Karen tried again, shoving the bag against the bars. But her noise drew attention, not from Brutus, who remained indifferent, but from neighbors who were outside enjoying the evening. Lights flicked on, voices called out, and soon several pairs of eyes were watching her. The scene was undeniable. Karen caught red-handed, attempting to provoke the bear yet again. Her plan collapsed in real time. Daniel stepped outside then, calm as always, his phone in hand, already streaming the footage from his cameras. The neighbors gathered, murmuring in disbelief as the truth unfolded before them. Karen stammered excuses, insisting she was testing the safety of the enclosure, but no one believed her anymore. Her credibility was gone. The HOA president was among those watching that night. His face was grim, his voice measured as he told Karen she had crossed a legal line. Trespassing was one thing, but attempting to provoke an animal could not be ignored. Within hours, official complaints were filed, and Karen found herself under investigation. For Daniel, it was the moment he had patiently awaited. He didn't need to yell, didn't need to fight, didn't need to stoop to her level. The footage, the witnesses, the evidence, all of it spoke for him. Karen had destroyed herself with her own obsession. The following week sealed her fate. The HOA issued a formal censure, stripping Karen of her self-appointed authority and banning her from committee positions. Several neighbors filed police reports, citing harassment and trespassing. The county inspector, previously neutral, now had grounds to issue warnings against her directly. Karen's house, once the hub of gossip and control, became a fortress of silence. Her allies deserted her. Parents warned their children to avoid her yard. Delivery drivers laughed about the crazy bear lady who had tried to outsmart an actual bear and failed. And Brutus? He became something of a local legend. Families walked by to see him lounging in the sun, his massive frame radiating calmness. Children pointed and giggled, parents snapped photos, and Daniel welcomed the visits with quiet pride. What Karen had meant to frame as a danger had become the neighborhood's most beloved attraction. The irony was not lost on anyone. Daniel never gloated, never rubbed salt in the wound. But neighbors noticed the faint smile he wore when Brutus would saunter to the fence and sit, as though silently daring anyone to honk again. Karen, meanwhile, remained isolated. Her SUV gathered dust, her blinds stayed drawn, her lawn grew ragged. She had wanted to be the enforcer, the authority, the one who set the rules. Instead, she had become the cautionary tale, the neighbor who honked at a bear and ended up destroying herself. In the end, the payback was savage not because Daniel orchestrated it, but because he didn't have to. Karen's downfall came from her own arrogance, her own obsession, her own refusal to back down. She honked, she trespassed, she provoked, and each time she was the only one who lost. The neighborhood moved on, stronger and closer than before. Karen's name faded from daily conversation, replaced by stories of Brutus's quirks, Daniel's kindness, and the strange summer when one woman tried to battle a bear and lost spectacularly. On quiet evenings, when the air was still and the sky glowed orange with sunset, Daniel would sit on his porch, Brutus sprawled lazily nearby in his enclosure. The bear's steady breathing was a reminder of patience, of calm strength, of power that didn't need to be flaunted. And across the street, behind shuttered windows, Karen sat alone with the weight of her own undoing. Because in the end, the truth was simple. You can honk at a bear, but the bear doesn't have to roar back. Sometimes silence and patience are the most savage payback of all.